Welcome. I'm really excited about the topic I'm going to speak about today. Today, we are going to talk about some of the practicalities of inclusion and also some of the kind of telltale signs that we're not as inclusive as we think. So the starting point is, across lots of different pieces of research, some academic, quite a bit industry orientated, there is evidence that people often assume, leaders, staff members, that they are more inclusive than they actually are. And this has come from talking to a number of colleagues and peers in the industry, as well as some of my own research. Often when I start off by doing inclusion within an organization, there's an assumption at the individual level that people are inclusive, or that others aren't inclusive, but that they are fine. And this can transcend then into the team or group level and later into the organizational. But usually when I hear it, it's that when I speak to people, they have the intention to be inclusive, and there is an assumption that that is resulting in an inclusive impact. Here's the thing, none of us, no matter what your background is, no matter how much you practice inclusion, are as inclusive as we think. And that's not because we're bad people, and it's not because we don't want to be, although some may not. Generally, it's because there is a difference between the intention to be inclusive, or the idea that we are inclusive, and the actual impact, how that translates when we're working with people. Because inclusion is often coming from our own framework. So what we consider to be inclusive, good practice, respectful, non-judgmental, all of the things we might think result in inclusion are often from our own frame of reference of what helps us to feel included, based on our values, our beliefs, the structures that we don't even know we have in our lives. And so we really need to think about inclusion, not from the perspective of our norm, and that's what we think is inclusive, but from the perspective of who is in the room and how are we including them. And sometimes when I work with leaders around this, there's this assumption that they should know the answers to that question. And I would say, if we aren't going to stereotype, if we're going to move beyond that idea that a certain particular group all have the same needs, then it moves us into the conversation of speaking to the people we wish to include, learning ways to integrate inclusive practices into what we're doing. One of the key ways to do that is actually at the very beginning of any process, any engagement, any meeting, any ongoing meetings that might occur, is to ask people what they need to thrive in this team, meeting, setting, process. What don't we want to see and what do we want to see? Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is that there's other times where you actually have to start a conversation to assess where people are at before you introduce these types of measurements, these types of agreements. And you're going to have to decide that from time to time based on the reality of the setting. Now, let's talk about some of the times and examples I have where people aren't inclusive versus when they are inclusive. And these are these subtle things that occur and that give me indicators that there's less inclusion in the setting than I want. Okay, so let's start with, what does an inclusive leader look like? What are they doing? The first thing that they're doing is they're managing their assumptions about what is normal and the way to do things. So this is something that I can spot quite quickly, because while we all have a frame of reference and a way of working with things, inclusive leaders don't assume that their way is the right way or the correct way. They assert that they have a way that might be valuable, but that it might also be helpful to consider other alternative methods. And this is really important when you're trying to do something in an organization that's new or different. Sometimes the structures that are usually used within that organization may be part of what's holding particular limitations or barriers to inclusion in place. And so one of the things to think about as an inclusive leader when you're trying to be more inclusive is holding that suspension of the notion that the way you do things is A, the only way, or B, the right way, or C, the way it should be done. Learning to hold that and be curious about how other people think we should do things is a really good starting point. Because often people assume we need to be inclusive once the process has begun, so we need to listen to everybody's voice or points of view. Whereas in reality, if you've set that meeting up with particular power dynamics, then you are already limiting inclusion. You're going to get less contribution from diverse perspectives. So the starting point is actually assuming that you may need to also agree the process and find new ways of working, rather than simply continue the ways of working and try to be inclusive within it. So there will be times where that's appropriate and times where that's not appropriate. The other thing that an inclusive leader will do, or somebody practicing inclusion, that sets them apart in a setting, is that they will be curious when other people share ideas that are contradicting to their own or jar with their own belief system. It's not that they aren't reactive, it's not that they don't feel it, but what they will do is they will be curious about where that other person is coming from, rather than competing their position against theirs. And that's what happens in non-inclusive leadership. There's often a power dynamic that emerges in multiple different conversations. The inclusive leader is always using their power to include and to improve performance with that inclusion. So that's another kind of signal if you're not being inclusive, or a signal that you are. The other thing that inclusive people do is they listen for nuances and unmet needs. So they assume that in every conversation, there is something they can learn and understand. And that doesn't mean they don't have something to offer, but they're curious about the unmet needs of the people they're talking to, and they're curious about the nuances. Here's an example. I say the word inclusion, and every single person listening to that has an assumption and a visual and an idea about what that is. Every single one of you listening right now have your own framework around that word. And if we were in conversation, if we were working together, I would want to know what that assumption is, what that understanding is, where it came from, why you framed it like that, if that framing will be helpful in this setting or not. Because if I don't do that, when we talk about inclusion, we can all assume everyone is talking about the same thing. And this is one of the biggest barriers to inclusive practice, is the assumption that inclusion is the same thing for everyone and that it looks the same way. Now, there is some science behind it. We know that inclusion requires two things. We know from measuring it that inclusion requires a balance of belonging and uniqueness. And that's from Shaw et al.'s 2011 work. And that's been replicated and reused time after time when we think about inclusion. Why does that matter? If your focus is overly on belonging, you are more likely to create assimilation or political correctness in the workplace rather than inclusion. If your focus is overly on uniqueness, this is where everybody is an individual and we overly focus on how they are unique, you're likely to create quite a competitive environment where each person has to compete for their uniqueness because that's what's valued. The balance of inclusion is that we would find spaces where we share something, and that creates the belonging. And we would find spaces where our uniqueness is valued for the value add. Now, let's be careful about this. Uniqueness sometimes in diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion work actually means something else. It doesn't really mean we value the belonging and the uniqueness. Sometimes diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion is focusing on the individual's identity. And that's not wrong. So multiple truths here. The ability, multiple truths, by the way, is a term that Myra Can, she's written the book, Working Within Diversity, psychotherapist, supervisor, coined as far as I know. But her way of working with multiple truths is really powerful. So if you're thinking about, if you're interested in kind of a psychological lens and you're curious about the difference in this framing, her work and her book is well worth checking out. There'll be links below. However, the assumption that uniqueness is identity alone leads to more stereotyping, and it leads to diversity hiring, and not in a positive discrimination way or not in a sustainable, planned way. Instead, what it assumes is that somebody's identity is the uniqueness they bring to the room. And while it might be part of the uniqueness, it isn't the complete uniqueness. Every person in every room, regardless of what they share, will have unique ways of thinking, being, experiencing the world, insights, philosophies, framework. And when we think about inclusion through that scientific lens of belonging and uniqueness, we need to be careful not to land social norms around the conversation of diversity and inclusion. What I mean by that is we have to stop assuming that inclusion is only for people who are deemed as diverse. And I'm going to talk about that. Diverse suggests that some people are non-diverse and some people are diverse. And that's kind of an oxymoron. It doesn't really work. The reality is that in our society, we have normed certain experiences, and then people outside of that experience often experience marginalization. Now, that is accurate and true. And if we are going to create a more equitable society and more inclusive organizations, then we need to consider that. We need to be aware that there are some people who have gained privilege that has led them to this experience, and there's others who haven't. And we must consider that in our decision making. But if we're thinking about inclusion at work and we're thinking about how we practice it, we need to move beyond stereotypes or the notion that someone's identity alone is their uniqueness. Actually, everybody's identity adds some uniqueness. Everybody's lived experience, beliefs, philosophies, frameworks, all of those things lend to uniqueness. And so if you're trying to be inclusive, you need to consider the uniqueness of every person you're working with, while also considering the belonging, the elements. What do we share? Do we share a goal? Do we share values? Do we share a vision? Do we share a purpose? Do we share values, ways of working? We must work and cultivate both belonging and the value of uniqueness, but it must go beyond the idea that uniqueness is within diversity. It is somehow about the others who are not the norm. The reason for this is, if I keep talking like that, I'm going to keep positioning a particular group of people as the dominant norm. And I'm going to stop seeing that there are differences and uniqueness that exists across the population. So that's one layer. The second layer is we're not going to ignore that there are power structures that unconsciously and sometimes consciously impact inclusion in our work. And what I mean by that is there are particular experiences that some of us have that give us privilege over other people's experiences. And I don't want to ignore that in this work. But what I don't want to do is assume that uniqueness is only for those who have been marginalized, because we again are setting a norm. We're suggesting that inclusion is good for some and not for others. Now, the challenge is when you mix in privilege with marginalization is that those of us who are privileged often don't know we're privileged. Privilege is often only viewable to those who are not, who do not have that privilege. And so there is this power struggle within the workplace of acknowledging that everyone belongs, even those with privileged identities. However, the rules of engagement, the way we use power may need to be adapted so that the environment itself as a collective can be more inclusive. And this goes back to simple structures like, how do you start meetings? Do you have the assumption that meetings should be a certain way? And that may come from your cultural framework rather than actually be the right way. So that's an example. So in the workplace, we've got to think about inclusion as that balance of belonging and uniqueness. Having a purpose in the organization. Inclusion is not just for the sake of inclusion. Inclusion is about contributing to the organization's purpose, individuals' performance, team performance, organizational performance. And we've got to understand that inclusion is part of how we do things around here, rather than a separate or additional agenda that we have on the table. So if you're trying to be inclusive, ultimately, this is the message of all of what I've just said. If you're trying to be inclusive, you don't look around the room and look for somebody who comes from a marginalized group to decide whether you should or shouldn't try to practice inclusion in this room. You don't use visual indicators or stereotypes or identity to make that decision. You decide that inclusion is important in every room, regardless of who's in the room, because inclusion allows people to have a sense of belonging and uniqueness that normalizes inclusion across the organization. It starts to normalize the types of conversations we're having and who we're having them with. And it allows us to create a more robust, inclusive way of working, not just when somebody comes into the room that we have somehow labeled as diverse or having a marginalized experience. There's a lot of invisible marginalization. And while that has a different impact on people to visual cues for marginalization, what we do know is that inclusion is good for everybody. Where it gets tricky and where it gets very challenging is where you compete groups within the workplace against each other. So you say things like, this particular group is talking too much and I want to hear more from this group. What is more effective than putting people into groups, which is part of the issue with inclusion, is that we're ignoring the individual. So what we might do instead of that is say, we've heard from a number of people. I'm curious about the people who haven't spoken yet. Or I'm curious about this point of view based on this person's workplace, areas of hobbies or interests that they've mentioned before, committees they're involved in. So learning to include people because it's good practice rather than a corrective practice at the point where you think there is some discrimination or marginalization occurring. So inclusion is an ongoing behavior. It's an ongoing conversation between you and people, you and groups, you and the organization. It isn't something that is just done when we perceive that there's been discrimination or marginalization. The other thing about how you can be more inclusive, and I think this one is probably really valuable in terms of considering how we have this natural bias, not me, it's them, and also this assumption that we're more inclusive than we actually are, meaning that we have the intention or the idea that we're inclusive and that our practices are inclusive, but actually the impact may not be that way. We may not be getting that feedback, to be sure. Is that when you're in meetings and we're talking about any topic, the question you need to consider is, how am I leaving room or creating space for others to contribute different perspectives, or to contribute different ideas of what good looks like, or to oppose, or to observe something within the dynamic? How do I offer a perspective and then create space, or create space and then offer a perspective? One of the things I've seen that is quite subtle, and it comes from weird, so let me get this right, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic experiences. So people from weird kind of geographies or locations, meaning people who come from that as their norm. There is this assumption when we're in environments and having conversations that come with that being your frame of reference. I have that frame of reference, okay? So me, I'll talk about me. There is an assumption that that frame of reference is correct because it dominates a number of different industries and environments and ways of working. And so a lot of the time when we talk about professionalism, when we start to boil it down, its history is rooted in often some unhealthy or unhelpful or disliked histories. So what we assume today to be professional conduct may in fact be white supremacy. It may in fact not be professionalism. It may be the performance of professionalism, or the performance of class, or the performance of whiteness, rather than professionalism, which is how I interact with my work and with others, is professional within this industry norm. And when we think about those of us who have experiences from coming from weird geographies and experiences, because they weird dominates a number of environments, we can often assume that it is the evolved, correct, right way, best way, without understanding that just because something is dominant and therefore normalized doesn't mean it is the most effective, the most inclusive, the most helpful, or the best way forward. And so one of the things I've learned, and this is both from moving through academia, moving through pharmaceuticals, moving through hospitality, moving through tech, moving through legal, moving through these industries in my work, one of the things I've learned is that you can often see the environments that are cultured from particular perspectives, and the assumption of what good looks like is based on that. And so when you start conversations, you are assuming not only that your position is helpful to add, but maybe even assuming it's the only position, or the most obvious, or the most dominant. And I get this in a lot of meetings when I do inclusion work, because I see inclusion as a vehicle for organizational performance. Look, my background's coaching psychology, working with leaders, thinking about how workplaces are, you spend the most time in workplaces, so how can we make sure that they are, and I don't just mean places, work groups, because obviously hybrid ways of working, things are changing, but we spend a lot of time in work in some way, like engaged in work. And they can either be places that build people up, and this, like, I see loads of people who thrive because of their workplace, or they can be places that slowly or drastically chip at people. And I've also seen that. And what we have to think about, like, from my point of view, inclusion, yes, it's morally important. Yes, I think society needs to be, and outside of my work in organizations, I have my position in activism and advocacy and considering how we create more fair and equal societies. But in an organization, I have to place this work in relation to the purpose of the organization, because from a basic groups dynamic point of view, is all groups need a purpose, otherwise they flounder and start creating their own purpose. And organizations, if you're trying to introduce something, you have to introduce it through the lens and through the practice of how it adds value to the purpose of the task. They are the only activities that are maintained in organizations, okay? The only ones maintained are the ones that add value to the task at hand. or are perceived to add value, because there's lots of things that are the dominant norm that do not add value, but are perceived to do so. So when we are thinking about inclusion, or when I'm always thinking about its role in contributing to the task of the organization, the task of the team, the task of the individuals. And this type of understanding allows us to weave inclusion into how we perform. It leads to more of that innovation, creativity, psychological safety, emotional intelligence. It leads to all of those things in the workplace more effectively. However, if I keep seeing inclusion in the workplace only through a moral lens, we will eventually find, and look, it's happening in loads of organizations, D&I work becomes something separate in some way, or it gets deprioritized when there's a crisis or a recession or pandemics or war. And so when we're thinking about inclusion and we're trying to be inclusive, we want to weave it into the way we do things because it improves performance. But if you are in an environment where you come from that weird framework, like I do and many others, there is an assumption that this framework is most effective, is correct, is right, not because we necessarily have compared it to others, but often because it might be the only framework we've come across in the workplace. And so when I'm trying to do inclusion with people, it can be very challenging for people to have conversations that I set up in the beginning to be very different to what the weird culture would originally use. Let me give you a couple of examples. So in Ireland, stories are a big thing, whether intentional or unintentional. Shinogues, that's how we transferred information from village to village. And we have in some way kept that alive. We tell a lot of stories when we drink. There's a lot of reminiscing, and not just drinking. At work, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of narratives. And I believe all cultures have this. However, in some frameworks, the desire to get to the task without understanding the relationship and the socializing that happens with storytelling and opinions can get in the way of us having a full concept of who is with us and what they value and how they're motivated and how they influence others. And so sometimes when I start meetings with not very clear questions, I do it on purpose, or I ask somebody to think about something rather than telling them what good looks like. Because part of the weird culture is that we're always looking to be right. We're looking for the right answers to be right, to be efficient. We're not always trying to develop a deeper understanding of ourselves or others in the conversation, or to build the social capital and currency with others. We're often using maybe authority, positional power to have a sense of currency rather than relational or social currency. And that's not true for everyone. I'm just pointing to some of my experiences where it was challenging to be inclusive, because it was challenging because people assumed that the way they have meetings is the right way. And there's multiple versions of this. So there is like a clear task for the meeting, a clear purpose to the meeting, terms of reference, the process the meeting is involved in. And those things can be helpful for certain contexts and certain moments. But when I'm talking to people about inclusion, or I'm trying to find out how inclusive we actually are and what we privilege in a particular organization, in other words, what do we value and give power to, then I'm going to need to use less structured processes for two reasons. One is, if I set in that first meeting the purpose or what good looks like, beyond having a loose purpose, I indirectly tell people kind of what I'm valuing, which then influences the meeting. The second thing is that there's an assumption that we all agree a way of working. Now, when I work with people and we've already agreed to do development, like inclusive development in some way, then we start with group agreements. But sometimes we need to start conversations from a learner's mindset, from that idea that I have something to learn here. I'm going to put something into the room and see what happens, rather than direct and control the environment. Now, obviously, if you're a leader, there's some meetings you need to host, you need to chair, you need to facilitate. But if you are trying to, and this is for in any role, if you are trying to create more inclusion in your organization, there's a lot more listening and curiosity that needs to be there than structure, because structure itself can limit inclusion. Okay, so a couple of other things we're thinking about when we're trying to be inclusive. Okay, so thinking about how we can include people and how they can do great work is really important. So we're not just thinking about inclusion for the sake of it, we're thinking about inclusion in relation to the purpose of the organization and the task at hand. Okay, Now, why does inclusion matter? Well, look, quite simply, it gets a lot out of people, okay? It improves psychological safety. Usually people are promoted or rewarded for higher emotional intelligence, because if you're inclusive, you would need a high degree of emotional intelligence for that inclusion to be effective. It also stops you limiting your team to your level of incompetence. So this is important. One of the challenges with leadership is if you assume you have the answers, then you are limiting your team to the level of your incompetence. You'll only ever bring them as far as you can bring yourself. You're ignoring that the team's collective competence might reach beyond yours, or an individual in a particular area might have competence beyond your own. And so inclusive leadership allows you to harness the competence of many other people and collective competence, which will always and often reach beyond your level of incompetence. It creates more innovative and creative outcomes, and we know that the research keeps talking about that. But also it improves ways of working and allows shared responsibility. What I find one of the challenges in organizations is that often when things are going wrong, we blame up. It's always leadership. And that's at any level, from the front line right back to senior leaders. Everyone is usually pointing up. And if you want to be an inclusive leader and you want more shared responsibility, then inclusive leadership lets you do that, because you start sharing responsibility. Yes, I have a role in this, and so do you. And so it creates more robust outcomes and insights and practices and ways of working. Inclusive leaders have to recognize their biases. So most of the time when I start processes, people assume they're more inclusive than they are. And then as we move through the process, and it's not because I do unconscious bias training, because I actually avoid that training for a couple of reasons. One is some of the research is suggesting that unbiased training does reduce the unconscious bias training, does reduce the unconsciousness, but it doesn't always reduce the bias, because there's an assumption that that bias is built based on knowledge rather than based on lived experiences, inherited norms, felt experiences, fears. And when things are built on emotions, they can't just be corrected through knowledge. So I don't really use unconscious bias training. I might incorporate understanding it, but I'm more focused on people reflecting and finding their own biases or receiving feedback from others for them to work on, than simply teaching them about the concept of it. So when people recognize, when leaders recognize that they have biases, and all of us do, I'm on the call, you're listening, every single one of us have biases we don't know about and biases we do. And so assuming that some people don't have unconscious bias, or some people after training are less unconsciously biased, isn't helpful. It's more helpful to assume that we're all biased, that it's a default in our brain, which it is, and that if we're trying to get more effective results in the workplace, working with those biases so they don't hold us back, or they don't create an incompetence in our practice is more helpful. But one of the things is they'll assume that they're right rather than be curious about others. And it's interesting, I work obviously in coaching, and I also work in kind of D&I spaces, and I work in leadership. So I kind of, using coaching, I end up in these other spaces. And one of the things that has become really evident to me is that there is an assumption, because your profession may align with humanistic values, that you are somehow more inclusive. The challenge with that is inclusion, while it may be a humanistic value, the practice of inclusion doesn't come simply because we value humanistic values or because we believe it's the right thing to do. Because inclusion is not natural, and not natural doesn't mean wrong. There's loads of things that aren't natural in the world that we work to. It's quite natural to be smelly and not to clean ourselves, but we do because it's better for society, it's better for ourselves, it's better for our hygiene. Inclusion is a bit like that. Just because we know that being clean is helpful for us and society doesn't mean we always shower. So inclusion is the same. Just because we know it's good for ourselves and others and society doesn't mean we are practicing inclusion. And often when I talk to leaders who may assume that they're inclusive, one of the barriers to that is that when I ask them to explain their practices, we start to find out that they're a little less inclusive than they think they are. And so I'm going to leave you with 3 things that will help you recognize your own bias. And when I say yours, I mean mine, I mean all of ours. But it will help you hopefully engage with conversations beyond maybe the weird view, but also beyond the view that our framework or your framework is correct. The first one is, if you're assuming that you're right, you're probably not being inclusive. So being curious and understanding will lead to more inclusive practices. If you're not reflecting on how your behavior, your beliefs, your values, your use of power may be impacting others, then that might help you work through some ways that you're creating barriers to inclusion. And also, if you're talking about general truths and you're not thinking about how differences exist and how you might actually value understanding those nuances, that can be really helpful. So if you're trying to be more inclusive and you also have this assumption that you are, the starting point is to use curiosity and to watch for all the moments where you have that feeling of I'm right, because that feeling of I'm right is usually the biggest barrier I find for most people, not just with inclusion, but with performance and with their effectiveness when they're trying to influence and work with others. There's going to be notes below in the comments that you've access to anything I've referenced. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you. Rate the podcast, give us some stars so that you can share it with others, and let me know how you're getting on across the socials at Sheila Walsh1. And I can't wait to hear from you.